My name is Joanne Crothers, and I will be attempting to assess the impacts of historical and contemporary events and issues on current educational context for Indigenous people. I would like to firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gadigal people, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. Let's go back to 1992. It was the International Year of the World's Indigenous People. The Indigenous people of Australia were calling for reconciliation, and Prime Minister Paul Keating delivered what will forever be known as the Redfern speech in Redfern Park in December 1992. This event was pivotal as it was historic. It was the first time a Prime Minister had recognised the historical travesties of Australia's Indigenous people, with firm admissions of colonialist wrongdoing. The Redfern speech is considered by many and expressed in such articles by Clark and Brent as the most influential and remembered address in Australian history. Clark, in his journal article in Overland in 2013, discusses the frames of reference Keating used to describe non-Indigenous and Indigenous people in his speech. As us and them, Clark argues that this verbal reference has affected the subsequent discourse of Aboriginal reconciliation ever since. Clark goes on to point out that to bridge such a cultural divide requires acknowledging the existence of one in the first place. This line of thought is similar to McConaughey's critique of Indigenous education processes. She believes that before issues of policy, curriculum and pedagogy can be debated, issues of culture must be considered. This generational, renewed nationalist way of thinking gave hope and drive to the Indigenous community of '92 and was the foundation behind some of the most influential and legislative and social debates and events to date. Keating was resolute in his efforts to rectify injustices noted in the Redfern speech. The Native Title Act was passed in '93, and in '95 Keating established the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Land Fund. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner role was also established in '93, and the reputable Bringing Them Home report was released soon after, detailing the effects on the stolen generations. The Australian history wars of the Howard government, 96 to 07, post-Keating, were arguably some of the most debated and controversial. Dr. Andrew Gunstone, in his paper titled Reconciliation, Nationalism and the History Wars in 2004, stated that many non-Indigenous Australians were shocked about the hidden historical foundations of this country, and this changed the way they thought about our history. It questioned the legitimacy of our very existence. Keating's speech drew on the truth of our nation's history and attempted to symbolically reconcile these issues with, first, a verbal recognition needed for social justice. Keating's successor, Prime Minister John Howard, disagreed to a formal apology, stating in an article by McKenna in '97 that he needs to ensure that our history as a nation is not written definitively by those who take the view that we should apologise for most of it. The Howard government did little for Indigenous confidence by, according to details in the Parliament of Australia's Overview of Indigenous Affairs, abandoned the terms social justice and self-determination and withdrew support from many of the initiatives and institutions that these terms were built on. This left Indigenous communities feeling bereft of political support, which unquestionably affected the relationship and trust that the Keating government had tried to maintain since he delivered the Redfern speech in 1992. It can be noted here that although the Howard government did introduce many policies focusing on practical reconciliation that would, yes, address material disadvantage amongst Aboriginal communities, it was proved, however, as referenced in Altman and Hunter's 2003 discussion paper abstract, that when comparing the relative well-being of Indigenous people as a whole with other Australians, the early period of 1991 to 1996 clearly outperforming. Evidently, the symbolic act of reconciliation, which was the crux of the Redfern speech, positively impacted Indigenous Australians and still affects practices and holds educational relevance today. Harrison and Greenfield discuss the importance of symbolic representation in education. Indeed, Indigenous symbolic gestures and portrayals in and around school grounds, and which are embedded in teaching resources, welcome and really necessitate community involvement and collaboration. Community participation, according to Mick Dodson, is one of the key elements of every successful model of Aboriginal education. But is this tokenistic symbolism enough? Take Buckskin's insightful question, for example. If in a school, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are only celebrated during NAIDOC Week, on Mabo Day or National Reconciliation Week by having students do dot paintings or having local community members teaching dance or painting children's faces, what does this teach students in the community about contemporary life? We have to ask the question, is this enough? Is this enough to warrant culturally respectful teachings of Indigenous perspectives within the educational context? We know that from the aftermath of the Redfern speech that symbolic gestures are effective in restoring well-being, identity and involvement for a time. But as Kevin Rudd points out in his Sorry speech in 2008, symbolism is not a sentiment that makes history, it's our actions that make history. And it seems Buckskin agrees, raising some valid points in his 2015 paper that must be addressed before the well-meaning symbolic gestures develop to positive, educational, active change. Buckskin refers to factors such as cultural competency, adequacy of language other than English, the LOTE programs, and appropriate and meaningful early education programs that will legitimise respectfully educating Indigenous students by what would otherwise be poorly resourced and underprepared teachers. Buckskin also believes that an education revolution needs to happen for this to take place. But we need to be mindful of political agendas here. Many believed Keating's speech was the perfect platform to begin active reconciliation. But this since has been hindered by the transient power and nature of government. The sentiments of Gardner's TEDx talks in 2011 resonates well when he says we need to consider an evolution of the teacher, not the revolution of a system, to develop strong connections with our Indigenous students, which will, in turn, line up with Chris Sara's Stronger Smarter philosophy, according to Vass on page 89, on developing positive cultural identity alongside high expectations for all involved in educating Indigenous students. If the education system holds in esteem the cultural importance of Australia's First Peoples by affirming their identity, self-esteem, sense of place and validity, current understandings of Indigenous cultures in the educational context will be supported through teacher standards and competencies and community awareness. Now, we really don't have to look far to appreciate how cultural inclusion within a national curriculum supports identity and respect for traditional and contemporary cultures. The New Zealand curriculum is saturated with Maori culture themes, particularly in the Treaty of Waitangi principles of partnership, protection and participation. According to the New Zealand curriculum, this fosters identity, language and culture as important expressions of what it means to be a culturally located learner. The Kahikata, the Maori education strategy, emphasises that culture counts and describes a commitment to knowing, respecting and valuing where students are, where they come from and building on what they bring with them. The Redfern speech was unstatedly revolutionary. As educators, we need to understand and implement key teaching tools specific for education based on a bicultural historical foundation that includes both Indigenous and non-Indigenous agendas, histories, cultures, etc. Understanding political agendas at the time of the Redfern speech, the timeline of Keating's successes and their legacies, all impact the way in which this generation of teachers view, understand and will deliver Indigenous education and perspectives. We as a union, which is represented through the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers and embodied particularly in Standards 1.4 and 2.4, have to demonstrate knowledge and understanding in the historical significance of the Redfern speech to be able to identify with culture, cultural identity and linguistic backgrounds significant to an educational context. Implementing Aboriginal pedagogies that are rich in quality teaching practices in Aboriginal education, such as relationship to place, a strong culture of collaboration among the school and community, and transition to school programs will, according to Harrison and Greenfield, also support current understandings of Indigenous cultures in education. The labyrinth here at Centennial Park in Sydney's East is a sacred domain that represents reflection. Maybe it is here that we as a nation need to reflect on the impacts of historical events, not only in educational contexts for Indigenous Australians, but for our commitment as a united country to preserving a culture and reconciling the past. Auntie Ali Golding, Aboriginal elder and wisdom keeper of the labyrinth, says, "Our culture is defined by the closeness of family circles and staying connected to the people within it. The labyrinth invites and welcomes people to walk the path together. It calls them to the land in oneness." The Redfern speech attempted to walk this proverbial path of oneness. Now, in the 21st century, it begins with us, as teachers, to enhance the significance and benefits of preserving the Indigenous culture, together with the Indigenous community and its people. Thank you.